I've lived in New York City all my life, but our current neighborhood, a quiet stretch in Queens, was where I'd finally put down roots. My son Alex was born here, and for more than a decade we'd enjoyed the place. I'd come to know the faces of everyone on our block, including the Grants who lived next door. Their son Jimmy was close in age to Alex, and the two boys had become inseparable over the years. Our house often felt like a second home to Jimmy, as he'd often spend hours playing with Alex, laughing and running through the halls like brothers. Everything changed during one of those typical New York autumn days. Leaves scattered across the sidewalks, the smell of rain lingering in the air. Alex had come running home alone, his face pale, voice shaking as he stammered, "Dad, Jimmy, he's gone." My heart dropped as he choked on his words, telling me that Jimmy had been hit by a car on the street just outside. I rushed out, but it was too late when I arrived. Jimmy was lying motionless on the road, surrounded by shocked onlookers. There was no sign of the car. It had vanished, leaving only shattered glass and shattered lives behind. The days that followed were a blur of grief. The Grants were devastated, and our neighborhood, usually vibrant and noisy, fell into a hushed mourning. Jimmy had been like family to me. His absence left a painful void. Alex, though heartbroken, seemed to handle the loss better than I expected. Yet after a couple of weeks, he started acting strangely. At first, it was little things I shrugged off. He'd tell me he heard footsteps in the hall at night, or that he'd seen a shadowy figure standing at the edge of our yard, right near the bushes where he and Jimmy used to play. "Dad," he'd whisper, clutching his blanket, "I think Jimmy's still here." I'd ruffle his hair, reassuring him. "It's just your imagination, buddy. You miss him. It's normal to feel like he's still around." But he insisted. "No, Dad, I saw him. Last night, he was standing outside my window. He looked sad." I chalked it up to grief, the mind's way of clinging to someone we've lost. But over time, Alex's insistence grew. He claimed Jimmy would visit his room, standing in the corner, not saying a word but watching him, waiting. I wanted to help him move on, so I gently suggested that maybe it was time he packed away the toys he and Jimmy had played with, hoping a fresh start would ease the memories. A few days later, the strange incidents began. It was subtle at first. I'd hear faint footsteps echoing through the hall in the dead of night, so soft they seemed to blend with the hum of the city. Our front door would sometimes creak open, though I'd be sure to lock it before bed. At first, I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe a draft slipping through the windows. But one night, something happened that I couldn't explain. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a soft knock on my door. My first thought was that Alex needed me, but as I got up and reached for the door, I saw a faint shadow in the crack of light coming from the hallway. The figure was small and childlike. My heart raced, a strange sense of familiarity washing over me. I swung the door open, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, silent. I brushed it off as a trick of the mind, but a gnawing feeling of unease settled over me. Things only got worse. One evening, while I was cleaning up in the kitchen, I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, chilling me to the bone. I turned around, half expecting to see the window open, but everything was shut tight. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. A fleeting figure standing in the backyard, just beyond the glass door. It was Jimmy staring at me, his face pale, his eyes empty. I blinked and he was gone. My heart raced as I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But Alex had seen him too. "Dad, Jimmy was in my room last night," he said quietly one morning, dark circles under his eyes. "He doesn't talk. He just stands there and watches. I think he's angry." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was impossible. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. The door knocking, the footsteps, the icy drafts, it was all too real. And Jimmy, he was there. Every night, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if he was demanding to be let inside. One night, unable to stand it any longer, I decided to confront whatever was haunting us. I waited until the house was silent, my heart pounding as I sat alone in the living room. Midnight came, and just as I'd feared, the knocking started. This time, it was relentless, echoing through the empty house. I got up, taking slow, steady steps toward the front door. When I opened it, I expected an empty street, the usual quiet of the neighborhood at night. But standing there was a figure, Jimmy. He looked up at me, his face pale and sorrowful. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he was gone, leaving me frozen in the doorway, the echoes of his presence lingering in the night air. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. Jimmy wasn't just a memory. He was something more, something that was keeping him tied to our home. And as much as I cared for him in life, this lingering presence was something I could no longer bear. I packed our things and arranged for us to stay with my sister across town. But even after we left, I couldn't find peace. The night we moved out, I dreamt of Jimmy. He stood in the middle of the street where he'd died, his gaze filled with a sadness I couldn't comprehend. I woke up in a cold sweat, the weight of his presence pressing down on me even miles away. Days turned into weeks, and I heard from neighbors that strange things still happened at the old house. The new occupants reported footsteps, cold drafts, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The street where Jimmy had been hit remained quiet, with no new leads on the car that had taken his life so suddenly. It was as if Jimmy's spirit was waiting, unresolved, his presence a constant reminder of a mystery that might never be solved. To this day, I still feel his gaze sometimes, especially on quiet, lonely nights. And every so often, when I walk past our old neighborhood, I hear the faint echo of his laughter, carried by the wind, a memory that refuses to fade. Jimmy may be gone, but something about him remains, lingering in the shadows, searching for the answers that even I can't provide. After completing my studies, I was ready to start my professional journey. My parents had advised me to get some job experience before starting my own business. Financially, we were stable, but they believed a few years in the workforce would teach me valuable lessons about the real world. So I found myself searching for jobs and an apartment. It didn't take long before I found the perfect place, a spacious, beautiful apartment with tall windows that let in plenty of light. I could almost see myself settling in there and building a life. However, the rent was steep, more than I could comfortably afford on my own. After some consideration, I decided to find a roommate to help share the cost. It wasn't something I'd planned to do, but the apartment was too perfect to give up. After interviewing a few people, I met Kevin. He was polite, quiet, and seemed responsible. He had a steady job and a calm demeanor, and he didn't come across as someone who would throw wild parties or cause chaos. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. Within a week, Kevin moved in, and for the first few months, everything went smoothly. Kevin kept to himself most of the time. We'd occasionally chat about our days or grab a meal together, but he was the kind of roommate who valued his privacy, and I was fine with that. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual about him. He went to work, paid his share of the rent on time, and didn't make a mess around the apartment. But over time, small things started happening that I couldn't quite explain. I began noticing things out of place around the apartment. A few times I came home to find the kitchen cupboards open or a chair pulled out from the table as if someone had just been sitting there. I brushed it off, thinking it was either me being forgetful or that Kevin had simply left things that way. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was osh. One night, as I was watching a movie alone in the living room, I heard Kevin talking on the phone in his room. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something strange about the tone, something tense and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but the feeling it left me with was unsettling. Over the next few weeks, I noticed him making these late-night phone calls more frequently. The conversations always seemed hushed and intense, and they would end abruptly as if he didn't want me to overhear. Around the same time, other strange things began happening. I started hearing noises at night. Soft footsteps shuffling down the hallway outside my room, whispers that seemed to come from the other side of my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was Kevin moving around, but the footsteps didn't make sense. They would start and stop, lingering outside my door, as if someone were standing there, listening. A few times, I called out to see if it was Kevin, but I never got an answer. After a particularly restless night, I decided to confront Kevin. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking if everything was okay and if he needed help with anything. He laughed it off, saying he was dealing with some work stress and that everything was fine. He seemed relaxed and casual, but the strange occurrences continued. I started sleeping with my door locked, just in case. Even though I didn't fully understand what was going on, A part of me felt like I needed to protect myself. Then one evening, something happened that shook me deeply. I had come home late from work to find Kevin pacing in the living room. He looked more agitated than I'd ever seen him, his face pale and his eyes darting around the room. He barely acknowledged me before disappearing into his room, shutting the door firmly behind him. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of Kevin shouting on the phone, his voice angry and desperate. He was saying things like, "They'll never find out, and it has to stay between us." I lay there frozen, feeling my heart race as I listened. In the morning, I debated asking him about it, but I decided against it. I was too afraid of what I might discover, and a part of me didn't want to make things awkward if it turned out to be nothing. But the fear continued to gnaw at me, and I began to avoid being in the apartment when Kevin was around. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly on edge. A few days later, as I was settling down for the night, I noticed flashing lights through my bedroom window. I pulled back the curtains to see several police cars parked outside the building. My stomach tightened as I heard loud footsteps in the hallway, followed by a sharp knock at the door. My hands shook as I opened the door to find several police officers standing there, their expressions serious. One of them asked to speak to Kevin. Kevin appeared in the hallway, looking strangely calm. He didn't say a word as the officers cuffed him and led him outside. My mind raced with questions, but I was too stunned to speak. After they left, I stood there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The whole scene felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The next morning, I turned on the news, hoping for an explanation. What I saw left me shaken. Kevin had been involved in a series of crimes across the city and had been under police investigation for months. He had managed to evade suspicion by keeping a low profile, blending in as an average guy with a steady job and a quiet demeanor. The late-night calls, the whispers, his tense behavior, it all made sense now. I couldn't believe I had been living with someone who had such a dark side, someone who had hidden so much behind a mask of normalcy. For days after his arrest, I couldn't shake the memories of those strange sounds and unsettling encounters. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if there had been any signs I had missed, any clues that could have warned me. The apartment, once a place I'd felt safe and happy in, now felt cold and haunted by memories I wanted to forget. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corner, reminded me of those eerie footsteps outside my door and Kevin's whispered phone calls. Eventually, I made the decision to move out. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer, not with the memories of everything that had happened there. I packed my things and found a smaller, quieter place where I felt safe. It wasn't as spacious or as beautiful as my first apartment, but it gave me the peace I needed. Looking back, I realized how little I had truly known about Kevin, despite living under the same roof. The experience taught me to be more cautious and to pay closer attention to the people I let into my life. My parents' advice about starting a job before jumping into anything big had seemed simple at first, but now I saw it as a lesson in understanding people and situations. The professional world was challenging, but nothing compared to what I'd learned from sharing my home with a stranger. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and the world is silent, I think back to those whispered conversations and the eerie noises outside my door. A chill runs down my spine as I wonder, did Kevin ever suspect that I knew something was wrong? Or was he just waiting for the day I would find out? My girlfriend Mia and I were thrilled about our planned weekend trip. A college friend's wedding was coming up, a 3-day event in a small, rural town, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape our busy routines and enjoy some peace. Instead of staying at a hotel, we booked a secluded Airbnb cabin in the woods. The listing photos showed a cozy wooden cabin with a fire pit, a small porch, and tall trees surrounding it. It looked idyllic, like something out of a movie. Ohi reception started winding down. The drive there took us deeper into the woods, far from any main roads or streetlights. We rolled down a gravel peon the first day. We arrived in town, checked in at our friend's wedding venue, and enjoyed the celebration. The wedding was beautiful, and the energy of being surrounded by friends made the night fly by. We decided to head to the cabin when Tath, and after several minutes, the cabin came into view under the glow of our headlights. It looked even more charming in person, perfectly isolated and tucked away from the rest of the world. When we parked, the owner, Mr. Grayson, was waiting for us. He was an older man with a kind but slightly overeager expression. He greeted us warmly, maybe a little too enthusiastically, but I brushed it off as just friendly country hospitality. He handed us the keys, walked us through the house rules, and then lingered for a while, chatting about the area and the woods around us. I felt like he was taking too long to leave, but I figured he was just a talkative host. Once he finally left, we settled in for the night. The cabin had a cozy charm, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a big window looking out into the dense trees. Mia commented on how peaceful it was, and I agreed. We both laughed about how nice it was to be disconnected, miles away from the rush of the city. But as the night grew later, something started to feel off. Now and then I thought I saw shadows moving outside the windows. I chalked it up to tree branches swaying in the wind, or maybe a few animals passing by. I didn't want to alarm Mia, so I kept quiet and tried to enjoy the tranquility of the woods. After all, we were far from home, and this cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. The next day, we spent most of our time at the wedding venue, celebrating with friends and catching up with people we hadn't seen in years. It was refreshing to see everyone, and for a while, I forgot about the strange feeling from the night before. When we finally left to return to the cabin, it was late. As we drove down the gravel path toward the cabin, something caught my attention. Fresh tire tracks leading toward the cabin. They were faint but new. I felt a slight unease but didn't want to worry Mia, so I kept it to myself. We unpacked, got comfortable, and began to unwind. As we were settling in for the night, we heard something outside. Footsteps. They crunched over the gravel and leaves surrounding the cabin, slow and deliberate. The sound seemed to circle the cabin, moving from one side to another. I glanced out the window, hoping to catch sight of an animal or something that would explain it, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, soft but steady, and then a loud knock. We both jumped. My heart raced as I called out, asking who was there, but there was no answer. We waited in silence, listening. After a moment, the footsteps resumed, but this time they were closer, pacing around the perimeter of the cabin. I was certain someone was outside, but I couldn't understand why they weren't answering. Just as I was about to call the owner, the footsteps stopped again. Minutes passed, and we heard nothing. Trying to stay calm, we locked all the doors and windows, double-checking every entry point. Hours crept by in silence until we finally fell into a light, uneasy sleep, both haunted by the thought that someone or something had been just outside watching. On the final day of the wedding, we packed up our bags and headed back to the wedding venue. We were eager to leave, hoping to put the eerie experience behind us. But as we arrived, we saw several police cars parked outside the venue, lights flashing. Guests were gathered in small groups, whispering. To our shock, Mr. Grayson, the Airbnb owner, was being led away in handcuffs. His expression was blank, almost as if he was in a trance. Curious, Mia and I approached a group of guests to find out what had happened. A friend whispered, "Mr. Grayson, he's been under investigation for a while now. He's been watching his guests for months." I felt a chill run down my spine as they continued to explain. The police had been tracking him after receiving multiple reports from previous guests who had experienced strange noises, shadowy figures outside their windows, and even attempted break-ins. Investigators discovered that he had been hiding cameras in various cabins he rented out, recording guests as they stayed there, unaware of his presence. Some reported seeing him lurking outside, watching them through the windows late at night. He'd even broken into some cabins, just to leave evidence of his presence behind. The thought of Mr. Grayson lurking around the cabin while we were inside, watching us from the shadows, sent a shiver down my spine. All those unsettling moments, the shadows, the footsteps, the knock, it was him. He'd been watching us the entire time, creeping around, waiting for us to let our guard down. And all the while we had thought we were alone, safe in the isolation of the woods. We drove home in silence, both of us unable to shake the feeling of being watched. It was a haunting reminder that sometimes the most beautiful places can hide the darkest secrets, and the quietest moments may just be when danger lurks the closest. After what felt like hours of running blindly, we burst out of the field and stumbled onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The cornfield stood silent as if nothing had happened, the tall stalks swaying gently under the night sky. We scrambled into the car and drove away, our hearts racing, not speaking until we were miles down the road. Halloween 2024 had brought us the ultimate scare, but not the kind we'd ever wanted. And sometimes when I think about that night, I wonder if that figure is still out there, hidden among the corn, waiting for the next group to wander too far into its field.